Thank you for joining us. My name is John Fleiter, and I serve on the Lou Douglas Lecture Series Committee. Tonight's lecture is jointly sponsored by the Lou Douglas Lecture Series on Public Issues and the Donald J. Adamczyk Distinguished Lecture Series in Sociology. Many others helped in bringing our guest speaker to campus tonight. I would like to thank the Office of the President, the Office of the Provost, the Assistant Provost for International Programs, the Dean of Arts and Sciences, the Dean of Agriculture, the Kansas Center for Rural Initiatives, the Women's Studies Program, the Department of Geography, the Department of Political Science, and last but not least, the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Social Work. A brief question and answer period will follow the lecture, and I encourage you to stay and participate in that. There are also a few books available in the forum, outside in the hallway outside the forum. And everyone is encouraged to participate in the reception following the lecture. It'll be held in the courtyard, so you're all invited to that as well. I will now turn things over to Professor Lynn Blomquist, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, and welcome to all of you. I am the head of the last but not least co-sponsor of this talk, and I think he probably meant it because it was the longest, but it's also very significant that it's also not the least because the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Social Work, see, I could say it, in fact, I have to say it, was the home department of our guest speaker this evening. Cornelia Butler Flora was a member of our department from 1970 to 1989. She had a very accomplished career here at K-State. Unfortunately, left and moved on to, we don't like to think as necessarily as bigger and better things, but to other things, and continued her very distinguished career. But I would like to point out that one reason why we have her here for the, that's partly sponsored by the Adamczyk Lecture Series, is Professor Adamczyk was a social demographer in our department, and was here from the mid-'70s until he passed away in the late 1990s. And I had the pleasure to work with him. I've also had the pleasure to work with Cornelia Butler Flora. And one thing that they have in common is they both began, as part of their early careers, focused on demographic change in the Midwest and Kansas in particular. In fact, Cornelia Butler Flora was the director of the Population Research Lab in our department, and when she stepped down from that position in order to take care of other responsibilities, she was replaced by Professor Adamczyk. So there's actually a very direct connection between our guest speaker tonight and one of the persons who this lecture is honoring. I would also like to point out that while at K-State, Cornelia Butler Flora was the first woman named Distinguished University Professor at K-State, which is a very prestigious award here at our university. She was also the first woman elected President of the Faculty Senate, and she had served in numerous other capacities and really was a wonderful colleague for us here, and we're pleased that she's been able to build on her distinguished career. As you could see from the PowerPoint slide, she currently is the, I'll make sure I get it right, the Charles F. Curtis Distinguished Professor of Agriculture and Sociology. She also is the director of the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development. And in order to give you some perspective on how she came to have such prestigious positions, let me say a little bit about her accomplishments. She has published over 60 refereed articles and 60 book chapters and 8 books, and that's just in the mornings. And for those of you who know Cornelia Butler Flora, you know that I'm probably not too far off. She is someone that is involved in a lot of things and handles them in such a masterful way that it just amazes those of us who have even a sense of how much she's been able to do. In fact, at dinner yesterday evening, she was saying that, I believe it was last year, she was actually traveling 260 days out of 365 days of the year, and still managed to contribute quite a bit to that list of publications that I just told you about. But I think most impressive about Cornelia Butler Flora, is that she's very much committed to the people who are part of the research that she conducts. She doesn't just analyze the experiences of people and then go off and report them in journal articles or book chapters and not be concerned about the kinds of things that they have to deal with. In fact, she's very much concerned about those things. And really her research, I think, could be summarized as involving three intertwined research foci. One is agriculture change, another are gender relations, and the third is comparative analysis of women and men in agriculture in different cultural settings. Much of her research is focused on comparing the Midwestern U.S., first Kansas, now Iowa, and other parts of the rural U.S. with agriculture in Latin America. This evening she's going to make a similar kind of comparison, although in this particular talk she's going to be comparing corn production in Iowa with corn production among the Hopi. And so without further ado, I will proudly introduce you to Cornelia Butler Flora.
I'm going to turn this on, push the switch all the way over. Okay, is this working? Okay. So it's always good to have something in your hand, but then I may need my hand free to make a dramatic gesture. Or on the other hand, to pick this up when I drop it. Sorry. At any rate, it's wonderful to be back at Kansas State. We had a really exciting time here. I think we were here with the beginning of the building and growth, and it's so exciting to see programs that were just beginning, doing really exciting things now. It's really really great to see our friends working in sustainable agriculture, to see what's happening with women's studies, to see what's happening in the sociology department, and to see this feeling that Kansas State University makes a difference in the entire state of Kansas, rural and urban, and it makes a difference because it is concerned about the whole state, not just agriculture, not just rural people, but how this whole piece of geography fits together and into a larger system. However, I'm going to talk about a crop that is actually growing in popularity in particularly western Kansas, where my mother-in-law farms, but I'm going to focus primarily on how corn as a crop can serve as a metaphor for different ways of people interacting with each other and with their surrounding natural resources. And I'm going to have to deal with this in the context of a globalizing society and also the notion of resistance to globalization. Now, back when I was starting out, that was 1923, but we talked then a lot about the notion of modernization. We would become modern. And I'm going to submit to you that the modernization project is a relatively failed project. And one of the goals of modernization, according to Max Weber, who speaks of the modern economy, is of course to make a highly mobile and portable labor force, therefore cutting our connections to each other and to the land. And what I'm going to look at is different ways of building relationships and different ways of seeing how production relates to people and to place. Now, I'm going to present this in terms of what we have come to call 6 capitals, and they're all explained in great detail in our book that is for sale in the lobby, but it's ridiculously expensive, so you just might want to thumb through it. But during our long time working at community development and agricultural change, we have been very concerned about what are the resources that are available in a community. We have shifted from looking at what isn't there to what is there. We've moved from a deficit approach to an asset-based approach. And when you have assets and you invest them to create new assets, they then become capital. And investment is always to a particular end, and the end I've put it up here are the ends that we're working with. I'm working now with a group called the National Rural Funders Collaborative. It involves the Ford Foundation and Kellogg Foundation and a bunch of regional funders, and we're funding rural collaborations on a regional basis across the country to help them increase the wealth, particularly of excluded people, to build transformative leadership, particularly again to give voice to excluded people, and to increase family self-sufficiency. And we see this as a part of these capitals that then can become invested in to create new resources. The first of these is natural capital. And I think when you're in rural areas, you're generally pretty much aware of what natural capital is. It's the soil, it's the water, or in case of drought, the lack thereof. It's the trees, the biodiversity, the birds, the landscape. All of this natural capital helps people define who they are and how they do things. And one can argue that the modernization project has been aimed at making us independent of the environment, to do our production in ways that it doesn't matter how much it rains, we can irrigate. It doesn't matter how much, this is why I needed that hand, how much hogs smell, we can figure out some technology to deal with it. So that we've been trying to remove ourselves from what previously were natural capital limitations. Next is cultural capital. And we see in many of the places where we work that cultural capital stems from the relationships with natural capital. They are the institutions. In Latin America, the term that they use is cosmovisión, cosmovision. Your worldview, how you think things work and how you explain things, are a very important part of cultural capital. And we see that as sort of the basis on which other things take place. We see these as sort of the basis. And then human capital. Human capital is what each individual possesses or has as qualities. It's both our potential and our reality. It involves our education, our skills that we've learned despite our education. It's our health is a very important part of human capital. And it also involves, in Latin America, the term is autoestimo. But the term I like to use in English is a sense of self-efficacy. What is your belief that you can actually do something rather than be acted upon? Do you see yourself as a victim or as a social actor able to make a difference in your own life and that of others? I separate that from social capital, which we see as those interrelationships among individuals. They are networks, norms of reciprocity, and trust. And these can either be within a group, which we call bonding social capital, or with other groups, which we call bridging social capital. And one of the important things about social capital is that it's pretty easy to destroy and fairly hard to build. Trust takes time. And a lot of the institutions that we set up are to replace social capital, because when you don't have trust, you better have a pretty darn good police department, right? If you don't have trust, you better have ironclad contracts. So that this notion is, and if you don't have trust, you better have pretty darn good meat inspectors, or you don't know what they're going to give you. In other words, we put in formal institutions when trust fails us, which is a good thing that we do, or else we'd probably all be poisoned. Another type of capital is political capital. And we view that as voice, the ability to participate in the decisions that affect your daily life, particularly those made by institutions. But political capital can also have another face, a darker side, which is clientelism. I don't have to worry about following the rules. I'm doing some work now in Alaska, and we know Senator Ted Stevens. That will take care of everything. In other words, clientelism can replace voice very often there. And finally, and we always put this last, although we also say it's essential, is financial and built capital. This, for communities and regions, involves investment capital and debt capital. It involves savings. It involves tax abatements and tax breaks. It involves grants, most people's favorite kind of capital, and is absolutely critical to making other things work. And in our way of looking at this is to say what we're really looking for is a balance among these spheres. We started out making our diagram a bunch of lines, and one of my Alaska friends said, no, these are really concentric, they're circles that overlap, because these are fuzzy boundaries, and the important thing is that we're considering them all, not that we've all got everything perfectly classified. So given this model of balance, what is it we see then in a variety of kinds of production systems that leads to balance or imbalance? And our hypothesis is the greater the balance, the more we're likely to have increased wealth of local people, more participation in transformative leadership, and more household self-sufficiency. Actually, Len exaggerated how much I travel. It was not 260 days, it was 220 days. But I just got back from Hawaii, where we're working with some Native Hawaiians in some very interesting projects. And one of the things we kept being reminded of is do not think of wealth just in money. If we do not think of wealth in terms of all these capitals, and they're particularly thinking about natural, cultural, human, and social capital, you're really going to mess it up. And of course, one could argue the modernization project is for us to get a single indicator of wealth, which is our financial capital, and to forget this need for balance. So here's some Iowa farmland. This is in June. And actually that's in the hilly part of Iowa. You'll notice the terraces. We thank you for investing in our terraces. You probably paid about 85% of the costs as taxpayers of those terraces. And we are able, as a result, to grow an awful lot of corn. Here's the landscape on the Hopi Reservation. Now, there's some differences. First of all, Hopi, the altitude at Hopi is about 4,000 feet higher than in Iowa. The rainfall is probably about 10 10% in good years of what we get in Iowa, maybe 5%. And it's fairly isolated and far away from things. Now, many of my friends think Iowa is isolated and far away from things, but they haven't been to Hopi, probably. So this is a harsh environment. Hopi were one of the first peoples who farmed in this, on this continent, as other Anasazi peoples were. Later on, herders, the Navajo, came in, and about that same time, the Spanish wandered through. And the Spanish thought, gee, this is, might as well settle here. So the Spanish did what they usually did. They sent some soldiers, and they sent their church representatives, which led to the revolt of the Pueblos in New Mexico and Arizona, at which point they were all driven out because they felt that one of the things the Spanish insisted upon was acceptance of their worldview. And one of the things the Hopis felt very strongly about was their worldview, which they understood because Hopi is the center of the universe, and you need to maintain balance. And the Spaniards were not into balance. This is Iowa again, and here's Hopi. Again, these are dramatic landscapes, absolutely gorgeous, but also very farmable. Now, these are the ravines. What you have in Hopi are hydrology is everything. And what the Hopi have learned is rain doesn't have to come where you are because water runs downhill. We all know that. And how it runs, and how you know it's run because that's how your father, through your mother, told you that this works. So you kind of know where you plant and when to plant. And you work together with everyone to try to do it. Here's rows of Iowa corn. Here are rows of Hopi corn. Look like corn bushes, right? Because Hopi plant many, they plant their own germplasm, that is to say, they save their own seeds, and they plant a lot of different corn grains in the same hole. If it looks like a very wet year, they'll put in fewer. If it looks like a drier year, they'll put in more. Because one of their goals is to raise enough. Now, this word is probably anti-American, enough. Because on those Iowa fields, we plant to get more. And more is our goal. Now, the fact that so what I'm going to contrast are these two end states, more and enough. And to see this kind of as a metaphor of what does it mean to be able to think about enough? What does that mean for issues of equality? What does that mean for issues of production? And what does it mean particularly for these issues of self-sufficiency and leadership? And by no means am I trying to hold up Hopi society as perfect. It is far from perfect. They have lots and lots of problems. Not unlike rural Iowa's problems, as a matter of fact. They have drug use. So does rural Iowa. They have problems of serious poverty. We have pockets of poverty in Iowa. But the notion is, how can we learn from the concept of enough as we go through and look at this? Now, this is a picture of a rainstorm, and this is sort of part of rain on Hopi. This is sort of where you plant corn. See the corn planted there? It looks pretty sandy. It's very sandy soil. But the point is, this is sort of where you know these fields. They do not interplant corn and beans because they feel you need different soil for corn than for beans. Many corn cultures interplant them. They do not. This is a snow on the reservation. Here's the snow a little bit later on. But this shows how the moisture comes. This is fairly dry snow. And the technologies that they develop to deal with the snow are rather different than our technologies that we have in Iowa. These photos come from some research that we're doing on reintegrating crops and livestock in western Iowa. And these are really good people whose goal is more. And this is his new, this is an integrated crop and livestock system. And here is where he is, his manure spreader. And of course the combine harvester. Now, here's Hopi's technology. This is a bean field. And this is how they capture the snow. You've got these very intricate bush setups there that allow the moisture to be captured, then go into the ground. One of the questions, I'm talking a little bit about the research that we're, participatory action research that we're doing there, and one of the questions that we asked is, when is the best time of the year for moisture? We asked that because the representatives from each village thought it was an important time. Well, it turns out that not everybody agrees. Some people think snow in February is the best time. Other people think rain in April is a better time. But everybody has definite opinions about this. But this is how you utilize that snow. Here's another view of those fields. Notice how sparsely, how the spacing between them. And they don't rotate their fields, but they rotate where they plant within the fields. So if you plant there this year, you'll plant in between them the coming year. Here's an example of the erosion that it causes by the fast rain. Here's where it's really bad. This is a 1920s picture. Notice the anthropologist in his tie in the waist-deep arroyo. Here's one here, a more modern day one, and they use this arroyo after it's been flooded out and plant. This is our research team where we had gotten together, we decided, and the reason for doing the research, and the reason I was asked in is because I'm old and know everybody, and they wanted somebody who could kind of help them do this kind of thing. And so I started meeting with them over a series of years, and they decided we really want to do a participatory research study to see how we can better do agriculture on the Hopi Reservation. But you can't do agriculture without language, and you can't do language without culture, and these are highly integrated pieces. So we sat around and we worked on what kind of questions we wanted. Now, of course, you really can't talk about agriculture in English. You have to talk about it in Hopi. And Hopi is a newly written language. There is a Hopi dictionary, but we were informed that the people who did the Hopi dictionary were from First Mesa, and that's really not how they talk on Third Mesa. So when we're working on getting these things down, we have our interviewers write up the interviews, and then using a great technology, SPSS for Windows. Have any of you used this as a social science? It's a great thing for participatory research because it's very easy to enter the data. It's very easy to come up with new categories. It's easy to combine categories, and you can do great analyses right there. So not only did people gather the data, which has been traditional, they also were here learning how to analyze the data. So we would ask hypotheses or ask ourselves questions and then use our data to answer it. And it was a very exciting experience for all of us. And here we are, we're doing bar graphs. So we can begin to compare. And in this one, I think we're comparing by age. Here we are working on this again. This is in a not-for-profit organization called Putabi on the reservation. Back to looking at the agriculture here. The rain is both good and bad. The female rains are the ones you like. They're the soft, gentle ones. The male rains take out the land, but they're also important because they send the water where you need them. Here's the corn again. And here is the one place on the reservation where they are able to use machine planting and ground preparation, which is by a spring. This is the only land that is privately held on the Hopi Reservation because it was previously owned by whites, and when it was then returned, it was privatized. The rest of the land is held in common by the clans, which are matrilocal. So you get the land of your mother, or when you marry, your wife. So this makes it very interesting. And one of the questions we ask is, do you need more land? And if you needed more land, how would you get it? Well, most people said, no, I don't need any more land. And they said, well, you'd go talk to the clan and get access to the land. And so this is a place, again, unlike our Iowa interviews, where everybody was regretting not having more land. People said, no, we have enough. There are some more scenes there. One of the things that we don't use this anymore in Iowa, but we did. Starlink corn, we're very proud of, they're very concerned about their germplasm. And outside we have a poster that shows the different kinds of Hopi corn. And they say quite rightly that Hopi corn grows best on the Hopi Reservation, because obviously this was selected over a long period of time for drought resistance, among other things. Whereas in Hopi, there's a belief that if you have a corn, there should be a good place where it can grow. In Iowa, we're constantly looking for ways we can produce more. Now, the Spanish, when they were there, did a few good things for the Hopi. They planted peach trees. And there's still peach trees left that are descendants of those Spanish 17th century orchards. And so the orchards are still there, and part of the learning about being Hopi is dealing with the peach trees. Here's a planting of some new peach trees. Maybe a little difficult to see the new peach tree. It's where the white thing is in the middle. But peaches and fruit are a very important part of family self-sufficiency. Now, not everybody raises fruit, but almost everybody eats fruit. And the point of fruit on the Hopi Reservation, as the point of everything you raise from the earth, is that you don't sell it. You don't trade it. You give it, or you receive it as a gift. And people were very hurt when we said, do you trade seed? It was sort of like saying, well, do you sneak communion wine? I mean, you don't do that. It's to be given away. More tree, that you do interplant peach trees with corn. And here's some more pole beans. You see here some very traditional, once again, here more beans, peach trees, and now moving into the gardens with the fencing, the traditional way of fencing, and this is a kiva, which is where the societies who run the ceremonies go. And the hillsides are used for a variety of crops. And this includes sort of the three sisters that southwestern societies have always used, corn, beans, and squash. These are store-bought squash seeds. These are Hopi squash seeds. And again, they're planted far apart, and there are squash dances and bean dances, and of course corn is absolutely essential to all the ceremonies. Here's a spring, and here are the gardens that were around the springs. And this, I think, is the best scene of these very well cared for gardens. Most Hopi do not irrigate except for their gardens. Here you see them again in the foreground, looking down the hill. The neat rows of beans, all in these wonderful terraced gardens. Lettuce and onions and peppers were something they raised quite a few of. And this is sort of the current state. And one of the things that came from our study was the need to help resurrect the gardens and the way of doing gardens, and the need to help young people do agriculture. Now, when you plant, planting is a very important time, and you generally have family groups that go out and do it. And planting is important to, again, this balance means you're relating to your seeds, and folks sing to their seeds. And one of my friends said, I told my son, go ahead and, sing a rap song. Just sing to them. Because the important thing is that communication, that keeping the culture, but keeping it in new and different ways. More new gardens, old gardens. The old, and you see these are very labor-intensive pieces. Here's some of the new being restored, or the old gardens now being brought back. Here, and of course they're doing it through youth. This, we will be pleased to note, is a 4-H youth group planting one of their old traditional gardens. That's doing as children always do when they're being photographed. Here's their irrigation system. And here's part of their housing up high on the mesa. This is, again, an older picture of the women in their famous butterfly hairdos. There's some very interesting older pictures of Hopi and Hopi ceremonies because the Hopi were a major attraction for the Santa Fe Railroad when they came through. And people would attend the various dances as kind of oddities until finally the Hopi said enough, and now they do not allow outsiders at their dances unless you're invited, and then you can come. One of the things they do with corn is grind it and make piki bread. And we found, one of the things I found out was grinding corn is also a very religious kind of activity. And so we couldn't ask people how much corn do you hand grind. Because again, that was a very personal religious question. So we finally said, how much corn do you bulk grind? Because one of the ideas that the youth group had as they started this project was perhaps if we had a village corn mill, this would help save some expenses on the part of the people. And here's a modern day girl taking the piki bread, about ready to throw it on the rock. Okay, so here is what is necessary to maintain the Hopi corn system. You say, why are people bothering to maintain something that is so incredibly unproductive? But the Hopi would say, no, it's very productive given what it is we're trying to achieve in terms of this balance. Natural capital is really important. Air, water, quality and quantity, landscape and biodiversity with multiple uses. The cultural capital is their cosmovision, their language, their rituals, and their ancestral products. Baskets, you saw some of the baskets they're weaving. These are really important pieces of their cultural capital that then feeds into the human capital, which is this notion of self-efficacy, degree of education, and skills and health. Now you notice I have cultural capital. Why do people always point to their computer screens when they're giving talks? Cultural capital is a very big sphere there, because cultural capital is very large and important. Human capital is smaller. They have a very good high school there, and they work really hard for students to finish high school, and they're very proud of their high school students. But not many go on to higher education, and in part it's because they don't want to leave their area. So part of what they're trying to work on is how do you bring education there. So human capital is smaller. Social capital is a bit bigger, but what they have is a lot of bonding networks within the tribe, across clans, within the groups, where there is trust and reciprocity. But there's not very much bridging capital to the outside, which means political capital and inclusion is also a very small part of this potential balance. And financial and build capital is the smallest of all in terms of this balance among them. And this is one of the reasons they're very interested in figuring out how do we do this to get a better balance. So the keys to keeping the Hopi corn system in place are cultural capital, which involves their ceremonies, their norms, their clans, and societies. And this is compared to the Iowa corn system. Now notice we have, the circles are quite different in terms of their comparative size. Natural capital I've put as relatively small, and I could be convinced otherwise, but soil and water are the really big issues there, and water quality in our part of the country is of increasing concern and importance, and farmers feel very much set upon if you have the bad taste to mention water quality. Cultural capital for Iowa farmers involves belief in science. And what science will do is solve your problems, because problems are linear. For the Hopi, we ask them, okay, what do you do to make your crops better, or to assure a good crop? And they pray, they talk to their crops, they work on themselves, and they feel that a bad crop means that you still have to work on your balance, both individually and as a group. On the other hand, the cultural capital in Iowa says, science will solve it. These are all little technical problems. They're not systems problems. And if we don't solve it, it's the land-grant university's fault. So the belief in science is a very important part of this cultural capital. And people say, appeal to science as how you make decisions about how you do things. I have human capital as substantial here. This is a very important part of Iowa's agricultural landscape. People really believe in terms of that what they do makes a difference on their land. We have a well-educated group of farmers that have very good skills, and though they're a little overweight, they have pretty good health. So human capital is a really good, strong base. However, social capital is something of great concern to, frankly, most farming communities in Iowa. They see this really declining, and what they mainly have is bridging networks to the outside and not bonding networks to themselves and their community. However, political capital is really, really big and important in Iowa farming. I'm going to talk a little bit about this in a minute. And therefore, financial and build capital in terms of income, wealth, security, credit, investment. In fact, we are busy now going through a second round of overcapitalizing agriculture one more time. Do you know the write-offs you can get for buying a new combine this year? It's huge. We in Iowa like it because it keeps our John Deere people employed. But it does build up debt pretty fast. So what keeps the Iowa corn system in place? And I would argue that where it's cultural capital with the Hopi, it's political capital in Iowa. We have very strong lobbying groups that are based on commodities not systems or people. We have a feed the world mythology, which basically, when you look at what we do with Iowa corn, is we feed some of the world's animals. But we're not necessarily feeding the world with our corn. And the other is a save the family farm hyperbole. We believe that if you just get the prices right, and everything will be fine. And we'll have all these family farmers left. Now, as a matter of fact, you've all seen the last, I'm sure you've studied it carefully, the last agricultural census, where in Iowa, as in here, we have getting fewer and fewer large farmers, but they're getting larger and larger. And we have practically no one sort of in the middle category. And we're getting a number of small farmers who probably are doing niche markets, who are very concerned about specific germplasm aimed at specific markets. But this is not the basis of our policy. We have direct payments through the commodity programs. We have the direct payment per bushel for corn. We have counter-cyclical payments for corn. And we have credit and deficiency payments for corn, which also grains and oilseeds and cotton. We grow soybeans too. Then we have USDA programs for international trade, which support our export of corn. We have a market access program that allows those who export corn. Remember, the people who are exporting corn are already buying it cheap because the farmer recovers their cost of production through the farm payments. So the market price of corn stays low. The market access trade program then you and I subsidize them to ship this overseas. There's a program for cooperators in the development of international markets. There are export credit guarantees. There are export increase programs if you can increase your exports more. And so you see countries like Mexico, where people in the countryside cannot sell anything because of imported U.S. corn, and rallies that say, sin maíz no hay país, which means without corn, we don't have a country. And yet we're feeding the world through our wonderful export programs. Then we have the USDA food program supported by funds from the Commodity Credit Corporation, include Food for Peace, Food for Developing and Friendly Countries, the McGovern-Dole International Food for Education and Child Nutrition Program, and this includes the cost of buying the commodities, packaging for fortification, enrichment, and preservation, international transportation, storage, and management within the recipient countries. So this is a pretty good deal for everybody, but people trying to build self-sufficiency in these developing and friendly countries. And then there are the other federal subsidies for exporting corn. We have soft credit programs for importing U.S. commodities. What is soft credit? It means you get very low interest rates and the chances of having your loan forgiven. So a lot of the folks that import our corn do it because we're giving them below market rates, even when interest rates are very low. We're subsidizing transportation in U.S. flagship shipping vessels. We give subsidies for barge transportation on navigable U.S. rivers. That doesn't make as much difference for Kansas, but it makes a huge difference when you go down the Mississippi River in our state. Then all that is necessary to maintain as many rivers as possible is navigable. And many people along the Mississippi are very concerned about the implications of constantly dredging and straightening the Mississippi River. Then we have local subsidies for Iowa's corn system. You don't have these in Kansas, but we have them there. Our property taxes and farmland depends on the price of corn in the market, not the market value of the land, nor what the producer actually receives for the corn. So what happens is we last did this in 1998, 96, 97, 98, when corn prices were very high. Now, at this time of fiscal crisis, corn prices were low, And so local taxes for local governments is down even further than a bad economy would predict because of the way we tax land in Iowa. Thus, as corn production increases, market prices decrease, and the resources of local governments decrease. And with all these subsidies, it requires 1,400 acres to make a living in conventional agriculture in Iowa. And the number of farms falls each year, land prices increase, our land prices that are high, community economies are in crisis, and pollution increases. So this is back to our argument, is what is the difference between enough and more? I'm certainly not arguing that we all become Hopi or that we live as subsistence producers. But I'm suggesting that perhaps the concept of enough, which means a rejection of the modernization project and looking at alternatives, may be a very viable way for, at least in Iowa, to begin thinking about what will our future be like if we don't want to have a landscape denuded of people and water that we can't possibly drink. Okay, thank you. And I promise to answer questions or even hear hostile comments, so, yes?
When the Hopis give each other things, don't they pay attention to how well they're reciprocated?
This is really interesting because that's what we would do. But the virtue is in giving, so that attention to reciprocation is not there as much as one would think. But the expectation of reciprocation is there. But the reciprocity comes not that I will give you peaches so you will give me peaches, but I will give you peaches, you will come to my daughter's wedding, we will dance together. You know, these are, the reciprocity is really not exchange.
One of the things that we need to think about as we do community development are what are our major goals of a particular community, and we can blow them up to the whole society. And I think there's always conflict between goals, and there might be 6 goals that you could use: growth, development, stability, stewardship, building trust with social capital, and then a whole bunch of social goals like equity. Do you see dramatic difference between the goals of Iowa and the goals of the Hopi, and how does stability fit into that?
Well, for Hopi, stability is balance. And therefore, that's sort of what you're seeking. And there's concern about stability because what's going to happen to youth? In Iowa, particularly in rural areas and in farming areas, the notion of stability is producing more and growth. But what's going to happen to the youth? So what is very interesting is they both have the contradictions of concern about youth coming from both the notion of balance and the notion of more. So I see some very similar goals in terms of concern about future generations, concern about who will farm the land and how, but they come from a very different sort of value, sort of basic assumptions about how the world works. The cultural capital is very different, that then sets these very similar sets of concerns. Yes, Jack?
Yeah, I got sort of conflicting messages from some things you were saying. One of the messages when you were talking about the traditional gardens suggests that the young people just aren't buying into the society. But the other message was that the young people don't go off to college because they want to stay there.
Right.
So can you enlighten me as to that? that difference?
The cultural capital is very, very strong. The older people understand that cultural capital is really based on agriculture and that whole process, and thus this desire to bring young people in. We ask people from whom they learned agriculture, often the grandfather, and at what age they began farming. 4, 5, some of the older ones at 10. In other words, that this is a way of transgenerational passing on of knowledge. And so there's that, on the one hand, not sure you really want to do that. On the other hand, beginning to learn that this is what keeps us together, this is what makes being here important. But these are contradictions. Some of the work we're doing in Alaska, in Native Alaskan villages, is this, that people need to go away sometimes for various kinds of higher education. But then, how do they go away and be able to come back? And that's this contradiction of dual cultures and balancing those cultures. And some of the outstanding leaders on Hopi are Harvard graduates who have come back. Many Hopi have been in the military. They come back as with this great potential as leaders as well. So you have this sets of contradictions and concerns of leaving, coming back. What do you bring back? Rural communities in Kansas have told me, you know, we want our young people to go away. We want them to go to college. We want them to do interesting things on Denver, the coast. We want them to come back then and bring these networks and this knowledge back here. Hopi are a little, because they don't have the same sense of self-efficacy in the larger culture, they feel it's more threatening to leave because you don't know who you'll be and you don't know how you'll be treated. So those are two kind of pieces of that. Well, yes?
I wasn't sure about how you had a very elaborate account of the political capital in Iowa farming in this commodity. And I was not so, I heard you in response to another question talk about how, for example, stability means different things in these two contexts. How do you see the political, what you're counting as political capital in your analysis in the Hopi? How does that, is that understood by them differently? Or is that, are they measuring themselves in the same kind of measures and saying, well, we don't have much, in a sense of clout? Or is that one of those things that's sort of, we're saying on some broad level, these are, okay, political capital, but they're really different sorts of things. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I guess what I'm using is in the larger cultural scheme of things, how much power do you have? And I was saying the Hopi probably have less. Now, Hopi are, sovereignty is, tribal sovereignty is a very important issue among Native Americans, as I'm sure you're all aware. But the Hopi as a nation doesn't make as much sense. It is not their traditional way of governance. Their traditional way of governance is with villages. So having the Hopi nation is kind of another sort of political contradiction they work and deal with. And I think one of the interesting pieces of that is as they are trying to get political capital, and their big issue has to do with Black Mesa, the use of their water to slurry down the coal from Black Mesa to a power plant. And basically it's, on the one hand, this is great income for the tribe. This tribe does not have gambling. On the other hand, it's pretty finite. And they're very worried about what will happen to their water as a result. And part of the political capital is trying to get some sort of voice in how these larger decisions are made. But it's also having a free and democratic debate among the Hopi themselves on what are the alternatives and how this works out. So I think if I ask them to say, how much political capital do you have, they would say, no, they don't pay any attention to us at all. We're a small tribe. But they would say we also have these key issues where what happens in the larger system has a huge impact on us, and we would like to have a voice. And it's figuring out how to have that.
I mean, it sounds like they have negative political capital, right? People have clout over them, they don't have any clout.
Yeah. Yes?
You compare and contrast those of the old guards and some of the new guards for the white chiefs who are working on this. How much has the culture and the agricultural society changed now so that it's more moving? Is it moving towards conventional agriculture? I mean, are there groups and they're trying to move it that way? Or is it actually like the older pictures that we saw?
It's very much like the older pictures, except for one thing. The very controversial piece is use of tractors for land preparation. And the very traditionalists believe that you shouldn't use tractors. It's, you know, you're not working hard enough or something if you don't use it. On the other hand, people who use tractors told our community representatives, you know, I worked really hard to earn the money for the tractor, therefore it's like work. Therefore, it's all right. We then looked at our measures of traditionalism, which was how you dealt with your crops. And we found that both traditionalists and non-traditionalists were equally likely to use tractors. So sort of like it's overcome that stigma. But again, it's really hard to use a tractor to plant 1.5 foot deep. So there's still going to be digging sticks for planting, but it's really handy to have it for soil preparation. So again, but you know, in this landscape, it's really hard to imagine planting corn like we do in Iowa. One of my colleagues told me when they did have a Hopi visit, and I did not hear this as hearsay, but it's such a good story I will repeat it. They looked at those scenes that I showed you and they said, what waste? And a very big theme in our interviews was the notion of waste, and in that of growing things you don't actually use or give away or control. So this is so too much is also part of their concerns.
It seems to me that in terms of cultural capital, in many of our communities here, a lot of reciprocity takes place within households, between households, through women, these sort of informal kinds of networks, just at a very, very small scale level with a lot of invisible work being done by whether it's done within households. How can we take that kind of reciprocity and make it into something larger? Have you seen work on that project?
Yeah, no, the question is, there is reciprocity going on, and we see it. We see it in Iowa. I mean, somebody has a heart attack, somebody will be there to help with the harvest. I mean, there is reciprocity in some towns that is really important. Women help out women, but there's a growing feeling of not connecting and not being connected. And so the notion is, how do we begin valuing that reciprocity and making it more visible, perhaps? That's what these good things about the ceremonies is, they make that giving really clear. Yeah.
You showed the pictures of Hopi. In some places in the ravines there, soils are being renewed, in other places they aren't. I was interested in the two systems. The natural capital is probably being used up faster in Iowa. Would you say the soils are being depleted faster?
Well, this is what some of my soil people tell me. I'm a sociologist.
But I would
Yeah.
think that would depend on
How you use it.
enough is much more compatible with keeping your natural
Yes, exactly.
going.
And keeping that balance. Again, and I think your point is there's some, the literature on Hopi agriculture is very, very interesting, and particularly how these soils do get renewed through the ravines, through the runoffs, through these kinds of rotation. One of the questions we asked was, are your soils tired? And what do you do if your soils are tired? And most of them said, no, the soils aren't tired, but if they are tired, I find another place. But there are no other places. In Iowa, we plant everything. Yeah.
Over the years, since you've given presentations like this to Iowa farmers, how has the reaction to what you said changed?
Well, of course, I usually give presentations to church groups, and the Farm Bureau has never invited me to talk. But what I'm seeing when I talk to farmers one-on-one, as I do in my research, is these are issues that really are a concern to them. These are issues that, in terms of feeling something's out of balance. And I think most people know that the political capital, the current subsidy system, eventually will no longer be there. And if it's not there, things will have to change very radically. But as long as you have all that machinery, and as long as you have all that debt on that machinery, you're unlikely to feel comfortable walking away from that and doing something different. Yeah.
When you're talking about the difference between Iowa farmers and Hopi farmers, the thing that comes to mind is how do you build cultural capital? And as an historian, I would say that the Hopi have always built cultural capital as their identification as the other. They are not part of mainstream American society, and they have a long history, far deeper than American society, to draw on for cultural capital. What about Iowa farmers? Last time I checked, they were pretty much part of the mainstream culture, at least according to the political pollsters. So how do you create a cultural capital in Iowa? And if the middle of the center of agricultural community is shrinking, who is there to build it? And who is there to decide what it means to be an agriculturalist at that time in order to create any kind of cultural continuity and community sense? I mean, don't Iowans want parity? Don't they want to live like all other Americans?
Well, this really does become the notion of what does living like other Americans mean? And if it means more, more of this, more of that, more of everything. You can never have enough. Never be too thin, never be too rich, right? Some of them want that, but there are other groups who are saying, oh, maybe that's not what's happening, because they understand that our ability to attach ourselves so well to objects means we don't attach ourselves to each other. So the point is, though, but unfortunately, a sense of cultural capital often stems from feeling like the victim. And somehow being a victim, because I'm not, Iowa farmers basically are doing actually quite well. As somebody pointed out, the tax laws are such they pay very little income taxes. They resent their property taxes, but they do pay some. But for many, there's that feeling of victim. For others, a sense of cultural capital comes from innovating in order to achieve more. And I think that's a very interesting cultural capital group that I think is much happier than those who are building their cultural capital around being victims. But I think you're absolutely right. Of course, Hopi have worked very hard to define everybody else as others. That's part of their resistance to this whole modernization project. They threw out the Spaniards. They threw out the railroad. So this kind of ability to resist that has that culture as a basis, I think is much stronger than we would find in Iowa. So what we might find for Iowa farmers is indeed that a few very large farms run by, doesn't mean we will have less people farming, but people will be employees of the farm management companies. They will get to do the things that the cultural capital says is most important, which is drive big machinery. And that may be enough. The decisions will be made one place. The driving the machines around are done there. You can still live on the land. But again, so then the question becomes, what are the important issues involved? And for Hopi, it comes back to issues of germplasm, the Hopi seed, the way we do things. But as you point out, in their exclusion, they have a very large advantage in terms of cultural capital. Thank you. Well, I suppose we should go chat. I appreciate you all sitting through the Hopi.